The night was still and heavy over a lonely stretch of highway, cutting through rural Tennessee, the kind of quiet that swallowed sound and left only the hum of tires on asphalt. A sleek silver SUV sliced through the darkness, its headlights carving a path under the faint glow of scattered streetlights that dotted the road like weary sentinels. It was well past midnight, and the world seemed to hold its breath until the silence shattered with the sudden wail of a siren and the flash of red and blue lights erupting in the SUV's rearview mirror. The vehicle slowed, its turn signal blinking, methodically as it eased onto the gravel shoulder, dust swirling in the beams of the pursuing patrol car. Inside, James Harrison gripped the steering wheel, his hands steady, his face a mask of calm etched with a flicker of irritation. At 55, he carried the weathered strength of a man who'd faced storms both literal and figurative, his broad shoulders squared beneath a crisp button-down shirt, his graying temples hinting at decades of hard-earned experience. James had just left a late-night briefing at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, a grueling session with top brass discussing troop deployments and counter-terrorism strategies. The drive back to his home in Knoxville was supposed to be a chance to unwind, to let the weight of classified dossiers and tense debates slip away. He sighed, glancing at the dashboard clock 1:47 a.m., before his eyes flicked to the mirror. The flashing lights weren't a surprise, not entirely. He'd been here before, pulled over on quiet roads for no reason other than the color of his skin and the gleam of his car. A black man in a high-end SUV at night was to some a red flag that needed no justification. He hadn't sped, hadn't swerved, hadn't broken a single law. His license was clean, his registration current, but he knew that didn't always matter. With a deep breath, he steeled himself, keeping both hands visible on the wheel as two officers stepped out of the patrol car. The first was Officer Tom Bradley, a squat, barrel-chested man in his 40s with a buzz cut and a swagger that screamed small-town authority. The second, Officer Eric Vaughn, was taller, leaner, his sharp features set in a cold, unreadable mask under the brim of his cap. Both wore pristine uniforms, their badges glinting under the streetlight as they approached, their boots crunching on the gravel. James watched them in the side mirror, his pulse steady but his mind racing through the protocol he'd drilled into his own subordinates. Stay calm, don't escalate, survive the encounter. Bradley reached the driver's window first, rapping on the glass with a knuckles-first knock that echoed in the quiet night. James lowered the window, letting a gust of cool air sweep in, tinged with the scent of damp earth and gasoline. "License and registration," Bradley barked, his voice rough and devoid of courtesy, his eyes boring into James with a mix of suspicion and disdain. James met his gaze unflinching. "Can I ask why I've been stopped?" he said, his tone low and even, a question rooted in reason rather than defiance. Bradley smirked, a crooked twist of his lips. "You didn't signal when you merged back there. Now hand over your papers." The lie was so blatant it almost made James laugh. His signal had been on, a habit ingrained from years of discipline. But he knew better than to argue. Not yet. He reached slowly into the glove box, retrieving his driver's license and registration, and passed them through the window. Bradley snatched them, glancing at the name James Harrison, but the flicker of recognition James half expected never came. To Bradley, he was just another face, another target. Vaughn stepped closer, arms crossed over his chest, his posture radiating contempt. "Where you coming from?" he asked, his voice sharp, probing. James kept his eyes forward, hands still on the wheel. "I'm heading home from a work trip." Vaughn snorted, leaning down to peer inside the SUV, his flashlight beam darting over the leather seats. "This your car? Sure you didn't borrow it from somewhere shady?" The sarcasm dripped like venom, a jab at James's very existence. A black man in a vehicle too nice for their assumptions. James's jaw tightened, a simmer of anger rising in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He'd faced this script before, knew its lines by heart. To them, he wasn't a man with a story. He was a stereotype, a threat to be cornered, and they had no idea how wrong they were. James Harrison sat motionless behind the wheel, the cool Tennessee night seeping through the open window, as Officer Tom Bradley flipped through his license and registration with a casual indifference that bordered on mockery. The lie about the Turn signal hung in the air, a flimsy excuse James could have dismantled in seconds, but he held his tongue. At 55, he'd learned the hard way that reason rarely won in moments like this, not when the other side held the guns and the power. His years in the military had taught him patience, strategy, the art of waiting for the right move. But the sting of being targeted again for nothing more than his skin and his success gnawed at him, a quiet fury he kept locked behind his calm exterior. Bradley handed the papers back with a grunt, his smirk widening as he leaned closer, his breath carrying the faint whiff of stale coffee and tobacco. "Get out of the car," he ordered, his tone sharp, final. James didn't move, his hands still gripping the wheel. "Do I have the right to know why?" he asked, his voice steady, a measured push against the wall of their authority. Bradley's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "Because I said so, that's why." The words were a brick, heavy with entitlement, meant to crush any resistance. Vaughn, standing just behind, let out a dry laugh, his arms still crossed. "What he means is, do what you're told. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." James exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening on the wheel as the absurdity of it all sank in. He'd spent over 3 decades serving his country, leading troops through war zones, briefing generals in fortified rooms, yet here, on a quiet highway in his own nation, he was reduced to this, a suspect without cause, a man stripped of dignity, by 2 officers who saw only his race. The anger flared hotter now, an ember threatening to blaze, but he kept it caged. He knew the stakes, knew how quickly this could spiral. "What does that mean?" he pressed, locking eyes with Bradley, his voice a low challenge that demanded an answer. The response came not in words, but in steel. Bradley's hand darted to his holster, and with a chilling click he drew his pistol, leveling it at James's head. "Get out of the car now!" he roared, his voice slicing through the night like a blade. James stared down the black barrel, its cold glint a stark contrast to the flashing lights painting the scene in red and blue. In his 30-plus years of service, he'd faced countless weapons, enemy rifles in desert sands, sniper scopes in jagged mountains, but never had he imagined one aimed at him on American soil, and for no reason beyond the color of his skin. He raised his hands slowly, not out of fear but calculation, aware that these men were itching for an excuse. One twitch, one misstep, and he'd be a headline. "Black man shot by police after traffic stop." He opened the door with deliberate care and stepped out, hands high, his boots crunching on the gravel as the night air bit through his shirt. Bradley lowered the gun slightly but kept it trained, his eyes gleaming with a predator's thrill. Vaughn stepped closer, sizing James up with a sneer. "Look at this, a black guy in a fancy car," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What did you do, scam welfare to pay for it?" James didn't reply, his silence a shield against their bait. He'd heard it all before, the slurs, the assumptions, and he'd learned to let them roll off to save his energy for the fight that mattered. Vaughn chuckled, then shoved James's shoulder, a rough push meant to provoke. James stumbled, but caught himself, his voice cutting through the tension. "Don't touch me," he said, low and firm, a warning wrapped in control. Bradley stepped forward, the gun still in hand, his face twisting with contempt. "You daring to give us orders?" he spat. "Who do you think you are?" James met, his gaze unflinching. "I'm a citizen who deserves fair treatment." Vaughn laughed, a harsh bark. "Fair? Listen to this guy, Bradley, he's talking about fairness." Bradley joined in, his grin wicked. "Fair for who, you people?" The racial jab landed hard, but James held steady, his jaw clenched. The anger wasn't just for them, it was for the system that emboldened them, that let them wield power like a club without fear of consequence. They saw him as prey, a lone black man in the night, easy to break. They had no clue who they'd stopped, no inkling that their world was about to flip upside down. The Tennessee night hung heavy around James Harrison as he stood on the gravel shoulder, hands raised, the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car casting eerie shadows across his silver SUV. Officer Tom Bradley's pistol hovered inches from his chest, its barrel a cold, unblinking threat, while Officer Eric Vaughn circled like a vulture, his sharp features twisted into a sneer. The air crackled with tension, The quiet highway now a stage for a confrontation James hadn't sought but couldn't avoid. At 55, he'd faced down enemies in war zones, stared into the abyss of combat. Yet here he was, pinned by two small-town cops who saw him not as a man, but as a symbol to be crushed. His voice, when he'd demanded fair treatment, still echoed in the silence, a challenge they refused to let slide. Bradley's face contorted with rage, the smirk replaced by a snarl. "You think you're in charge here?" he growled, tapping, the gun against James's chest, the metal thudding against his sternum. "Get on your knees now." James didn't move, his eyes locked on Bradley's, steady and unafraid. "No," he said, the single word a quiet thunderclap, a refusal rooted in decades of standing tall. Vaughan barked a laugh, stepping closer. "Oh, he's a tough one, Bradley, thinks he's too good for us." Bradley's patience snapped, his voice rising to a roar. "I said get down." James held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Why?" he asked, calm but piercing. "Because I said so," Bradley shouted, his face reddening, the gun trembling slightly in his grip. The answer was a flimsy shield, a tyrant's excuse, and it fueled the fire in James's chest. He'd spent his life upholding laws, defending a nation only to be stripped of dignity by men who wielded their badges like crowns. Before he could speak again, Vaughan lunged, grabbing James's shoulders with both hands, trying to force him down. James, built solid from years of training, didn't budge, his strength a silent rebuke. "Get on the ground," Bradley bellowed, his control slipping. When James still didn't yield, Bradley raised the pistol high and brought the butt down, hard on the back of James's head. The blow landed with a sickening thud, pain exploding behind his eyes, but James staggered only briefly, catching himself before he fell. Blood trickled warm down his neck, but he straightened, his resolve unbroken. Vaughan whistled, a mocking note. "Stubborn bastard, he'll kneel eventually." Bradley, enraged by the defiance, shoved James with both hands, sending him off balance. James dropped to one knee, the gravel biting into his skin through his trousers, but he refused to collapse fully. "There you go," Vaughan said, clapping his hands like a spectator at a twisted show. "Finally." James looked up, his eyes burning, not with submission, but with a quiet fury they couldn't comprehend. Bradley cursed, then swung his boot, kicking James hard in the back. The force sent him sprawling face down, his cheek scraping against the rough pavement, tiny pebbles embedding in his skin. He tasted dirt and blood, but he showed no pain, his body still, his mind racing. Vaughan leaned down, his voice a venomous whisper in James's ear. "Welcome to reality, tough guy." Bradley laughed, a harsh guttural sound. "Maybe he thinks he's somebody special." Vaughan nodded, smirking. "Yeah, look at him, probably fancies himself a big shot. A businessman, maybe?" Bradley stepped over to the SUV, yanking the door open with a grunt. "Let's see what this big guy has," he said, diving into the vehicle with the reckless abandon of a thief. He rummaged through the glove box, tossing papers into the back. Seat James's registration, insurance, a notepad scattering them like trash. James turned his head, watching the violation unfold, and for the first time that night a raw, unfiltered anger surged through him. "You have no warrant," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, authoritative and unshaken. Bradley ignored, him continuing his search, while Vaughan loomed over James, grinning. "Well, big man, feeling small yet?" James pushed himself up to his knees, his eyes locking onto Vaughan's, colder than the night around them. "You're breaking the law," he said, each word deliberate, a warning they laughed off. Bradley straightened, hands on his hips, chuckling. "Oh, are we breaking the law? Who are you to lecture us about that?" James's gaze didn't waver. "I'm a federal employee," he said, his voice low but resonant, a bombshell dropped into their smug certainty. The laughter died, replaced by a stunned silence. Bradley's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. "Federal employee? Don't lie to us." James said nothing, his calm defiance a wall they couldn't breach, and it rattled them more than any shout could have. The gravel bit into James Harrison's knees as he knelt on the Tennessee highway, the night air sharp against the blood trickling down his neck from Bradley's blow. Officer Tom Bradley stood over him, hands on his hips, his pistol now holstered. but his arrogance still blazing, while Officer Eric Vaughan paced nearby, his flashlight beam dancing across the wrecked interior of James's SUV. Papers littered the back seat, a testament to their illegal search, and the two men still smirked, convinced they held all the cards. James's words, "I'm a federal employee," hung in the air, a quiet detonation they'd dismissed as a bluff, but the seed of doubt had taken root. Bradley squinted at him, his bravado faltering for a split second. "You're full of it," he sneered, but his voice lacked its earlier bite. James sat up straighter, ignoring the throbbing in his skull, his hands resting calmly on his thighs. The patrol car's lights bathed his face in red and blue, but his eyes remained steady, a seasoned warrior's gaze that unnerved them. "I want to make a phone call," he said, his tone even but laced with an authority that made Vaughan pause mid-step. Bradley crossed his arms, scoffing. "A phone call? What for gonna cry to a lawyer? Go ahead, waste your time. No one's bailing you out of this." Vaughan chuckled, leaning against the SUV. "Yeah, let's see it. We love a good show." They saw him as a nobody, a black man with a nice car, maybe a small-time hustler at best, never imagining the power he held. In his pocket, James reached slowly into his shirt, his movements deliberate under Bradley's watchful eye. "Careful," Bradley warned, his hand twitching toward his gun. "I'm just getting my phone," James replied, his calm unshaken as he pulled out the device. Vaughan shrugged, smirking. "Fine, let him call. Make it quick." James dialed, a number he'd known by heart for decades, his thumb steady despite the ache pulsing through his head. The line rang once before a deep voice answered, clipped and commanding. "This is General William Pierce." James's tone softened slightly, but his words stayed firm. "General Pierce, it's Colonel James Harrison." A beat of silence followed, then Pierce's voice sharpened with concern. "James, what's going on?" James glanced at the two officers, who were still snickering, oblivious to the abyss yawning beneath them. "I'm being detained by two local officers on Highway 64 in Tennessee," he said, each word clear and cutting. "No justification. They've insulted me, used unlawful force, and searched my vehicle without a warrant." Pierce's response was immediate, his tone icing over. "Their names, give them to me." James raised his phone, snapping a quick photo of Bradley and Vaughan standing by his SUV, and sent it to Pierce. Vaughan frowned, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Who? You calling, huh?" James lowered the phone, his lips curling faintly. "Someone who can end your careers tonight." Bradley's scowl deepened, but before he could retort, his shoulder radio crackled to life, slicing through their arrogance. "Bradley, Vaughan, this is dispatch. You've got someone you shouldn't be holding. Release him immediately. That's an order." The words hit like a thunderbolt, wiping the smirks from their faces. They exchanged a bewildered glance, Bradley fumbling for the radio. "What?" James rose slowly, brushing the dust from his shirt with a measured calm, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a dark blue card, edged in gold, a military ID, and held it up, letting the light catch the embossed text. "Colonel James Harrison, United States Army, Fort Bragg." The shift was instantaneous. Vaughan blinked rapidly, his face paling to a ghostly white, while Bradley's mouth opened and closed, words failing him. This is," Vaughan stammered, his voice a faint croak. Bradley cleared his throat, forcing a semblance of control. "We had a misunderstanding here, sir." James tilted his head, his eyes icy. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, slow and deliberate. "You didn't know who I was." Bradley swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, we didn't—" James cut him off, his voice a blade. "So if I wasn't a colonel, if I was just a regular black man, what then?" The question hung unanswered, a damning mirror to their actions, and they shrank under its weight. The Tennessee night seemed to close in around the gravel shoulder of Highway 64 as James Harrison stood tall, his military ID glinting under the patrol car's flashing lights. The air was thick with the scent of dust and tension, the once smug faces of Officer Tom Bradley and Officer Eric Vaughan now drained of color, their bravado crumbling like ash in the wind. The radio's command, "Release him immediately," still echoed in their ears, a death knell to their control. James's words, sharp and deliberate, hung unanswered. If I wasn't a colonel, if I was just a regular black man, what then? Bradley's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his hands twitching at his sides while Vaughan stared at the ground, his flashlight dangling uselessly. They had no defense, no shield against the truth staring them down. Bradley tried to salvage the wreckage, his voice a shaky imitation of authority. "Look, Colonel Harrison, sir, this was just a mix-up. We didn't know who you were, no harm meant." His eyes darted to Vaughan, seeking backup, but Vaughan only nodded weakly, his earlier swagger gone. James's gaze didn't soften, his face a mask of steel forged by decades of discipline. "A mix-up," he repeated, his tone low and cutting. "You put a gun to my head, beat me, searched my car without cause. You call that no harm?" Bradley flinched, his excuse faltering. "We were just doing our job, sir, following procedure." James took a step forward, his presence towering despite the blood drying on his neck. "Your job doesn't include assaulting a citizen for no reason. If I weren't a colonel, you'd have hauled me off, fabricated a charge, and called it a night." The accusation landed like a punch, and the officers recoiled, their silence a confession. Vaughan muttered something under his breath, barely audible, but Bradley pressed on, desperation creeping in. "We didn't mean no offense, sir. You gotta understand." James cut him off, his voice cold as the night. "What did you call me? Hurlier? A welfare scammer, that's your no offense?" Bradley's mouth opened, then closed, his face reddening as he grasped for words that wouldn't come. Vaughan shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing the gravel, his eyes avoiding James's piercing stare. They were unraveling, their power stripped bare by the man they'd tried to break. Before they could muster another excuse, the distant wail of sirens pierced the quiet, growing louder as headlights sliced through the darkness. A second police vehicle roared up, its tires crunching to a stop behind Bradley and Vaughan's patrol car. The doors flew open, and 2 officers from the Internal Affairs Unit stepped out, their faces grim under the glow of the streetlights. Behind them emerged a middle-aged man with a commanding air, his badge gleaming. Chief Daniel Carver. His sharp eyes swept the scene, taking in James's blood-streaked shirt, the scattered papers in the SUV, and the 2 officers standing like scolded children. He strode forward, his jaw tight, and stopped in front of James, his gaze lingering on the military ID still in James's hand. "Colonel Harrison," Carver said, his voice low but firm, carrying a hint of regret. "I'm Chief Daniel Carver, Tennessee Highway Patrol. What the hell happened here?" Bradley jumped in, his tone frantic. "Chief, it was a misunderstanding. We didn't know who he was." Carver silenced him with a glare, his hand slicing through the air. "I don't want to hear it from you yet." He turned back to James, his expression softening slightly. "Sir, I need your account." James straightened, his voice steady despite the ache pulsing through his skull. "I was driving home from Fort Bragg when these 2 stopped me without cause. They lied about a traffic violation, drew a gun, assaulted me, forced me to the ground and searched my vehicle illegally. I called General Pierce, and here we are." Carver's face darkened as he listened, his eyes flicking to the Internal Affairs officers who were already pulling out recording devices. He nodded to one of them, and a crackling playback began Bradley's voice snarling, "Get out of the car now," followed by Vaughan's taunts and the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. The chief's jaw clenched tighter with each word, and when the recording ended, he whirled on Bradley and Vaughan. "Are you out of your damn minds?" he roared. Bradley paled, stammering. "Sir, we just—" "Shut it," Carver snapped. "Your body cams caught everything, every word, every move. Don't even try to spin this." Bradley and Vaughan stood speechless, their careers teetering on the edge. Carver turned back to James, his tone shifting to apology. "Colonel, on behalf of the department, I'm deeply sorry for this. It's unacceptable." James nodded, but his eyes remained hard. "Sorry's a start, Chief, but it's not enough. I want these 2 held accountable fully. They don't get to do this again." Carver met his gaze, then turned to his subordinates, his voice like iron. "Bradley, Vaughan, you're suspended. Effective now. Badges, guns, hand them over." Bradley's hands shook as he unclipped his badge, while Vaughan nearly dropped his face a mask of disbelief. The shift was complete. James was no longer the prey, but the one dictating the terms. The gravel shoulder of Highway 64 buzzed with a grim energy as Chief Daniel Carver stood over Officers Tom Bradley and Eric Vaughan, their badges now clutched in the hands of an internal affairs officer. The flashing lights of two patrol cars painted the scene in stark reds and blues, illuminating James Harrison's silver SUV and the scattered papers spilling from its open door. James stood nearby, his shirt stained with blood and dust, his posture unyielding despite the throbbing in his head. At 55, he'd seen chaos battlefields, crises, the weight of command, but this, a betrayal on home soil, cut deeper. Bradley and Vaughan, stripped of their gear, looked small, their earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable dread as the reality of their actions sank in. Carver's voice broke the silence, sharp and resolute. "This isn't over for you two," he said, his eyes boring into them. "You're not just suspended, you're done unless Internal Affairs says otherwise." Bradley tried to protest, his voice cracking. "Chief, please, just hear us out." "There's nothing to hear," Carver barked, cutting him off. "You assaulted a federal officer, threatened his life and trashed his rights all on tape. You're lucky he's still standing." He turned to James, his expression a mix of respect and guilt. "Colonel, I'm ordering a full investigation starting tonight. This goes beyond these two. If there's rot in my force, we're digging it out." James nodded, his voice calm but firm. "It's not just about me, Chief. It's about the system that lets this happen. Make it right for everyone." The investigation kicked off with ruthless efficiency. Body cam footage from Bradley and Vaughan was pulled within hours, a damning reel of their racist taunts, welfare scammer, get on your knees, and the thud of Bradley's gun against James's head. The audio captured Vaughan's laughter, Bradley's threats, every moment of their unchecked power. Internal Affairs synced it with dashcam recordings, painting a picture so clear even the staunchest defenders couldn't deny it. Word spread, fast first to the local precinct, then beyond. By morning, the story hit Knoxville news stations, headlines screaming, "Army Colonel assaulted by cops in traffic stop." Social media erupted, hashtags like Justice for Harrison trending as passenger. Videos from nearby cars surfaced, showing the brutality in grainy, unfiltered detail. Bradley and Vaughan's fate was sealed swiftly. The police union made a half-hearted attempt to shield them, citing stress of the job, but public outrage fueled by the footage drowned it out. Within days, they were officially fired, their names blacklisted from law enforcement roles. In Tennessee, the case didn't stop there. Federal attention descended, with the Justice Department launching a probe into the Highway Patrol's broader practices. James's ordeal wasn't isolated soon. Dozens of black residents came forward, their stories chillingly similar, stopped without cause, insulted, threatened, some beaten. A mechanic from Chattanooga recounted a nightstick to the ribs for talking back. A teacher from Memphis described a gun pressed to her temple for asking why. The floodgates opened, and the media feasted, amplifying voices long ignored. Chief Carver, under siege from all sides, couldn't dodge the spotlight. At a press conference, his face haggard but resolute, he faced a sea of microphones. "This department failed Colonel Harrison and others," he admitted, his voice steady, despite the hecklers. "We're overhauling everything, hiring, training, oversight. No one with a badge here will get away with this again." The pledge was a start, but skepticism lingered. Reform was a promise often broken. James watched the broadcast from his Knoxville home, his expression unreadable. He'd been offered platforms, interviews, speeches with civil rights groups, but he waved them off. "This isn't about me," he told a persistent reporter. "It's about the ones who can't call a general to save them." The ripple effect was undeniable. Community forums sprang up, demanding accountability. Protests flared in Nashville and beyond, banners reading, "End the abuse." The investigation widened, uncovering a pattern of misconduct, stretching back. Years' cases buried, complaints ignored. Bradley and Vaughan became symbols of a reckoning, their downfall a warning to others. For James, it was a bitter victory. He'd forced the system to blink, but he knew the fight was far from won. The night lingered in his bones, not just the pain, but the weight of knowing how close he'd come to being another statistic, and how many others hadn't escaped. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Highway 64 in Tennessee, casting a warm, amber glow across the rolling hills and stretching shadows along the asphalt. where James Harrison's silver SUV glided smoothly. Weeks had passed since that fateful night, and the road felt different now, not just a stretch of pavement, but a battleground where he'd stood his ground and won. At 55, James carried the scars of that encounter. The faint bruise on his neck had faded, but the memory of Officer Tom Bradley's gun and Officer Eric Vaughan's taunts lingered like a low hum in his mind. He drove with the windows cracked, the breeze carrying the scent of pine and earth, a stark contrast to the stale tension of that midnight stop. This time, no sirens chased him, no lights flashed in his mirror. He was no longer a victim with a barrel to his head. He was a man who'd turned the tables, a colonel who'd forced a reckoning. Back in Knoxville, James settled into his routine, the quiet of his home a balm after the chaos. His office at Fort Bragg had buzzed with calls, colleagues offering support, superiors praising his restraint, but he brushed it off, redirecting focus to his work. The victory wasn't personal glory. It was a crack in a system he'd long known was flawed. Bradley and Vaughan were gone, their careers reduced to rubble, fired, disgraced, their names a cautionary whisper in precincts across the state. The federal probe had widened, unearthing a trail of abuses within the Tennessee Highway Patrol. Falsified reports, ignored complaints, a culture that shielded the guilty. Black voices, once silenced, now roared stories of harassment and brutality, spilling into town halls and TV screens, each one a thread in a tapestry of injustice James had helped unravel. Chief Daniel Carver faced the fallout head-on, his press conference promises tested by a skeptical public. Reforms rolled out new training on de-escalation, stricter vetting for recruits, body cam audits, but James watched with guarded hope. He'd seen too many pledges falter, too many systems bend but not break. Still, the change was tangible. Officers sidelined, policies rewritten, a spotlight that refused to dim. Human rights groups reached out, urging him to speak, to lead, but James declined. "I'm not the story," he told a persistent activist over the phone, his voice firm. "The story is every black man and woman who's faced this and couldn't fight back. Justice has to reach them." His words weren't a soundbite, they were a mission, a quiet vow rooted in decades of service. The impact rippled beyond Tennessee. Protests flared in Memphis and Nashville, marchers hoisting signs, "No more Bradleys, no more Vaughans," editorials dissected the case. Lawmakers debated oversight bills and police departments. Nationwide scrambled to review their own ranks. James's stand had lit a fuse, igniting a broader call for accountability that echoed in barbershops, churches, and living rooms. For Bradley and Vaughan, the cost was total jobs lost, reputations shredded, their lives a shadow of what they'd been. Vaughan retreated to a small apartment, dodging reporters. Bradley faced whispers of civil suits, his swagger replaced by a hunted look. They'd thought themselves untouchable, but James had proven otherwise, a lesson carved in their downfall. One evening, as dusk painted the sky red, James drove that same stretch of Highway 64 again, the familiar hum of the engine a quiet companion. He passed the spot where he'd knelt, where gravel had bitten his skin, and felt no triumph, only resolve. The night had been a mirror, reflecting a truth he'd known too long. That power, unchecked, devoured the innocent. He'd survived it, turned it back on itself, but he thought of those who hadn't names he'd never know, lives snuffed out or scarred by the same arrogance he'd faced. That weight drove him, a silent promise to keep pushing, not just for himself but for them. The story of that night didn't fade, it grew, a narrative etched into the collective conscience. It was told by those who'd seen it, amplified by those who'd felt it, a testament that justice, though slow, could strike true. For James, it was a chapter closed but never forgotten, a spur to his unwavering fight. He'd proven no one had the right to trample another. That power bowed to truth when pressed hard enough. To those who heard his tale, it was a call: stand firm, speak loud, demand better. Bradley and Vaughan's lesson was one for the ages. Impunity had an expiration date, and James Harrison had set it ticking. As the highway stretched ahead, he drove on, unbroken, a man who'd won not just for himself, but for a future he'd never stop shaping.